Welcome to this laryngitis-filled edition of the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. I am the laryngitis-suffering John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Okay, you don't sound like you have laryngitis. Social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Some of us didn't attend a rave this weekend. Hi, John.
There you go. And, of course, Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John, and a special hello to all of our subscribers at the Commentary Magazine podcast YouTube channel. You know, I monitor our subscriptions on our YouTube channel every day, and I'm proud to say that we are now close to 12,000 subscribers. We have 11,800 subscribers, and I just want to encourage everyone, even if you don't watch us on YouTube, just take a second, go to our YouTube channel, and like and subscribe our videos. I think we should have a new goal, 15,000 by the end of June. That's the goal I'm setting out, 15,000 subscribers. I think we can do it.
Okay, here's my promise. If we get to 15,000 subscribers,
yes,
I will, like Jerry Lewis during the Moscow District Telethon, I will sing "You'll Never Walk Alone" and cry.
Love it.
I weep as I sing "You'll Never Walk Alone"
Let's do it.
to our blessed listeners and viewers. And thank you all for listening and viewing. We convene here on a sad morning, 36 hours after a illegal Egyptian immigrant is not the right word. Egyptian illegally present in the United States on a tourist visa, which he overstayed, made 18 incendiary devices. People, they're referred to as Molotov cocktails, which is sort of like a cutesy term by now, and is actually a handmade firebomb, as you can see if you watch the video. I wouldn't even call it a demonstration, just a gathering of Jews in Boulder, Colorado, to keep attention on the plight of the hostages in Israel. This man threw these firebombs at those gathered. Somewhere between 4 and 8 severely injured. As a doctor friend of mine said, injury in fire is about the worst injury you can suffer in terms of pain, and so the people who are in the hospital need an extra dose of prayer and hope for healing, refuah shlema, because it is so terrible what happened to them, and the aftermath is equally terrible, especially 12 days after the murders in Israel at the Capital Jewish Museum of the two Jewish Christian Israeli embassy staffers shot in the back by a radical American leftist, as opposed to this case where we had some kind of a extremist who told the cops after he was arrested that he was looking to kill Zionists, all Zionists, and that he would do it again. So that's my summary.
And of course, last month we had the firebombing of the home of Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania while he and his family slept during Pesach, Passover.
Also a firebomb.
Yeah, arson. Yeah. That too was by a far left radical who is anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist. And that's kind of the tissue that connects now radical Islam and the radical left, is hatred for Israel and, of course, hatred for Jews, because these assailants make no distinction between Israeli and Jew. And this should be a wake-up call to American Jewish institutions, because no matter how much you want to orient yourself toward the cause of social justice and talk about tikkun olam and talk about the changing hearts and minds over difficult processes and conversations, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. These people are hate-filled. They make no distinction between Israelis and Jews in the diaspora. and they have escalated. And so while it was just protest marches in October 2023, it was just ripping down the images of the hostages, more than 20 still alive in Hamas captivity, in the fall of 2023 and the winter of 2024, whether it was bullying, harassment, violence directed against Jews on college campuses throughout 2024, the occupation of administration buildings, the taking of campus employees hostage throughout the past year. It's now escalated into outright violence, murder, fire bombings. We also forget the attack that happened on New Year's Day in New Orleans, the Bourbon Street attack, car ramming attack, right? This is omnipresent. And I think my final point for the moment is, let's be clear who's responsible. I've encountered a flurry of articles in the past 24 hours. There must have been a message that went out on Journalist or whatever the current iteration of that newsletter group chat for liberal journalists is, saying that actually, the real problem here is Donald Trump's not talking enough about anti-Semitism. Well, that's a little bit odd to me because President Trump has denounced all of these attacks. President Trump right now is being attacked by the left for trying to root out anti-Semitism on America's college campuses. Oh, and by the way, President Trump's immigration agenda would have kicked this guy out of the country before he gruesomely injured our fellow citizens. So don't give me this baloney that's somehow Trump's fault. It's not.
There's also, I think it's worth noting that, for a long time when you have discussions with people about what was going on in the Middle East, you would have this contingent, as Matt says, who would say, oh, we actually, let's talk about peace, let's talk about cooperation, let's talk about how everyone can get along. That has been absent since October 7th in all of the rhetoric I've seen, whether it's on college campuses, whether it's among far left activists. They are over and over telling us what they want to do, which is globalize the Intifada, commit acts of violence. Now, some of them will stay with just violent rhetoric and wearing Hamas headbands and cosplaying being revolutionaries on Columbia's libraries, but others are going to end up doing what we have seen in the last few months, which is actually commit acts of violence, intend to murder and maim, and actually succeed in doing that. And that's where I think, as much as we're all free speech advocates, and we all on this podcast are, there has to start being some responsibility for what is being invoked, incited, and encouraged here. And that's actually where I think the political left is in dire straits, because they have been unwilling to call this what it is. Even the headlines and some of the news stories covering this terrible attack in Boulder, an attack, by the way, that was a regular vigil held by elderly citizens in that community to highlight the fact that there are still people being held hostage by Hamas. That attack was, no one wanted to use the word Jews or hostages held by Hamas or any of the things that would have shown clearly what this was. And this is where I think the public has to start insisting on the truth. We saw this as well, and I know we'll talk about this later, with the claims about the Israel military firing on people trying to get aid in Gaza. Also, a lot of untruths circulated this weekend. But this rhetoric, globalize the Intifada, is an incitement, a call for violence. It has been consistent. It has been all over the place in this country, and it is time to call it out. I agree with Matt that Trump has obviously been much more outspoken about this. I do wish that the Truth Social post he put up in the immediate aftermath had mentioned anti-Semitism. He kind of got distracted by the immigration question. But clearly this is an effort by the left to try to, I don't know, like a squid with ink, distract people from the fact that this administration is at least calling this out on campus and elsewhere.
There's been a game that the media has been playing since October 7th, 2023, which is to say that these protesters are pro-Palestinian. They even early on they would say anti-war, pro-Palestinian protesters, and then people like us would write pro-Hamas protesters, right? Or the media would say they pro-Palestinian protesters who use slogans that some Jews consider to be anti-Semitic. Things like that. This is all garbage. I mean, if it will keep going on, but it goes to the level of straight up lying that has been covering this entire movement, which has been headed toward targeted violence at Jews from the very start, since before Israel reacted to Hamas's war of extermination launched on October 7th. The idea that these are pro Palestinian protesters or anti war protesters, they are simply representatives, um, endorsers, champions of terrorism on our soil. And this is the inevitable result.
The phrase globalize the Intifada. Let's unpack this a little bit, because this is something that is being said by those who wish to encourage an intifada going global. What is an intifada? Well, there were two intifadas, uprisings, in Israel and in the environs of Israel in the late 20th century and at the very beginning of the 21st. People may remember the Second Intifada. That was actually a series of bombings, largely in and around Jerusalem, but other places, that killed more than 1,000 Israelis and caused Israel to stage a kind of military assault on the West Bank to remove the bomb making facilities and factories and pipeline that the Palestinians had created, largely in the city of Jenin. But 14 years or 13 years before that intifada was what was called the First Intifada, and that broke out in 1987 when there was no independent Palestinian Authority. That, of course, was created by the Oslo Accords in 1993. That authority coming into being after, in the mid-90s, gave the Palestinians sort of dominion over large swaths of the West Bank, which they used to funnel guns and bomb-making facilities and materiel to the most militant of them, to create the conditions of the Intifada, which were summoned into being by Yasser Arafat after he rejected a peace deal offered by Israel and Bill Clinton, both in 2000 and early 2001. And so rather than accept the deal, he triggered a terror war, which was the logical end result of a death cult system rather than a national liberation nationalist movement that would seek to have its own country on, much of the West Bank. But 13 years earlier was the First Intifada, and because there were no bomb-making facilities and there was no heavy weaponry or anything like that in Palestinian hands, they resorted to rocks and firebombs, Molotov cocktails. And so when you say globalize the Intifada, that is now happening on American soil. The use of firebombs in Pennsylvania, in Harrisburg, and in Boulder is the First Intifada coming to our shores. Nadav Ayal, who is known to many of our listeners, I think, as a commentator on Dan Senor's Call Me Back podcast, sent Dan an email that he then released to his listeners. And I want to read a little bit of it because it sort of explains what we're talking about here. Ayal writes, I've been covering terror attacks for over 20 years. I began my career as a journalist reporting from the West Bank for Israel's Army Radio. I've seen Molotov cocktails thrown with my own eyes, and I've seen the aftermath of such attacks. But seeing these scenes from Boulder were deeply shocking, even more so the realization that this was a replication and imitation of terrorist attacks in Israel. One of the most infamous attacks during the time of the First Intifada was the firebombing of the Moses family's car as they drove from Alfei Menashe to Tel Aviv during Passover 1987. As they passed near the Palestinian village of Hableh, a Molotov cocktail was thrown, hitting their car and igniting it. Ofra Moses, the mother, was 6 months pregnant. Despite her husband's efforts to save her, she was burned alive. Their 5-year-old son, Tal, was critically injured and later died. The father and 2 other children were seriously wounded, but survived. So he saw this. Anyway, I'm bringing this up only to say that this is not a slogan. It is now an operational doctrine that is being carried out inside the United States. Is it individual? Is it simply lone wolves being crazy? Possibly. Possibly not. Possibly not.
We'll talk about the slogan woke mind virus, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be coordinated by a foreign government, which, as you suggest, may well be, to have some type of kind of loose conspiracy or just kind of shared value system. Because this idea that Israel is committing war crimes and Hamas apparently is somehow a prostrate victim to the IDF, and the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza, and in the West Bank, which continues to support October 7th, well, they're innocents and they're being victimized here. That is like the air we breathe now. It's everywhere, and even more so in the corners of different, either far left radical socialist precincts and or Arab Muslim online chat groups. And I just want to say, I don't think the immigration question is a distraction. I really don't. This man was here illegally. He told authorities that he'd been planning the attack for over a year because he wanted to wait until his daughter graduated from high school. I'm sorry. Kick out the whole family. Kick them all out. If they overstayed a tourist visa, they should not be in this country. He comes to this country, and what does he do? He brings with him his ancient hatreds and then imposes those hatreds on American Jews, elderly American Jews who just want to protest silently against the terrorists who are keeping other Jews hostage. It's insane. So you cannot say that this is a distraction. Right. Because of what our immigration policy has been for 20 years, we have imported the Intifada. That's what we've done. It was just waiting, and now it's activated. So we have to stop it.
I agree, and I think also why this is so central is that why is this guy... We live in the United States. The United States provides us with freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the essential belief that you can do what you're going to do wherever you want to do it until the moment at which you start committing a crime, in which case you can be intercepted or, the authorities can interpose themselves. What do I mean by this? He's standing there across the street from these old people talking about the hostages, yelling and screaming at them. He doesn't have a shirt on. He's walking back and forth with a bottle. It turns out he has a bunch of things on the ground in front of him, which are these other Molotov cocktails. Name me a country on earth where a person of authority wouldn't have simply swept up, gone in, taken a truncheon, hit him over the head, dragged him into a van, and taken him off somewhere to be thrown into a dank jail.
This is actually where I think we need to start having more of a broken windows theory of policing about these anti-Semitic activities, because they are, look, a lot of these campuses, for example, a lot of cities have overlooked the vandalism against Jewish institutions, against synagogues and elsewhere. They haven't pursued or prosecuted at large scale people committing these smaller acts, all of which allows for a culture, a sensibility that it's totally fine. And the fact that you can have someone ranting and raving, clearly, with violent intent, standing across the street from people peacefully protesting, and it still took law enforcement they got this guy, thank goodness, but it took, emergency responders and elsewhere too long to get to the victims. We need to be more careful. Jewish institutions have been doing this for years with their own private security. But law enforcement officials need to start, anytime there's one of these gatherings, anytime we've had many of them here in Washington, D.C., there's almost always an element of them that becomes quite violent, confrontational, aggressive on the streets. And that is where we need to start cracking down, because those are crimes. Even the small bore crimes like vandalism, if gone unprosecuted, lead people to believe that they can be even more lawless.
Okay, so to follow the broken windows analogy, to Matt's point about why illegal immigration or our how we deal with those
The
who come into the
students,
country.
the student visas,
Right, right.
right? No, we know
That is broken windows. In other words, the
Yeah.
guy comes here on a tourist visa and overstays his welcome. Broken windows theory would say if people like that have a reasonable expectation, either you get him on the overstaying the student visa or the tourist visa, because your idea might be that if he stays too long, he's already committed a crime
He
and
did
he may
apply for
commit a worse
asylum, though.
crime.
He worked the system in that he did apply for asylum request, which I believe was turned down or was either
Yes.
in process. So he
No,
was
but
working
in other words,
Right.
he was, I think, turned down, but it was the Biden administration's or somebody's decision during the Biden administration to let him stay here while his case was being adjudicated, which was not necessary. Simple fact of the matter is he applied for student visa, he overstayed his visa. I'm not saying that people who overstay their student visas are all going to start throwing Molotov cocktails at Jews, but I am going to say that people from Muslim countries who are walking around, going on the internet, researching how to make Molotov cocktails, doing stuff like that.
tried to buy a gun.
Oh, he tried to buy a gun.
Tried to buy a gun,
Mhm.
and the gun shop said, "You're an illegal immigrant. We can't give you a gun."
Yeah. So my point here is that there are a lot of different ways to look at broken windows theory, and immigration law is a perfect place to start now, because if you are willing to break the laws of the United States when you're here as a guest of the United States, what other laws are you going to be willing to break while you remain here? So no, it stands to reason that most people who are doing this because they want to work and they want to keep their nose, they don't want to be exposed to the authorities because they want to stay here, so they keep quiet and they keep their heads down. But not necessarily. What scenes did we see after the border completely broke down and all of the people who got in were being shipped around to different places, including into Midtown Manhattan? What did we see those people do? Having fights with each other, like, stabbing people, pushing people on subway platforms, all staying in one hotel on Madison Avenue and 44th Street. It was like a crime zone. Somebody here in New York, a girl has a 1% chance of surviving an attack on Randall's Island. She was jogging. That's a place where they had placed some illegals in temporary housing. Again, I'm not saying that with 15 million people here illegally that you can then say every one of them is a potential terrorist, but not one of them has a right to be here.
But that has to be combined, I think, again, with the shooter at the museum here in Washington, D.C. was a citizen. He was not illegal.
Well, that's
he was a
important.
radicalized, homegrown terrorist.
Right.
So I think we have to see this as a layered strategy where, yes, you definitely use immigration policy and enforcement as one aspect, but you also I drive often near the Israeli embassy, and since October 7th, there have been these protesters. Sometimes they block the street. They try to surround your car at first. They've had to have a progressively larger zone and more, protection from law enforcement for anyone even driving near that area. There's no reason for that kind of threatening behavior. The people who block streets, who, do all these sorts of things, they should be promptly arrested and prosecuted. And the prosecution of these lower level crimes is, I think, where there's a real weak link for those of us on the side of law and order and prosecution, because progressive prosecutors in blue cities and states where a lot of this protest happens are not going to enforce the law.
And the problem is that those prosecutors are largely elected, and they are being elected by the people of Washington, D.C., of Philadelphia, of San Francisco, where the progressive prosecutor was actually ousted in a recall, Portland, all these places where they have, the Open Society Institute and the people around the Open Society Institute funding these campaigns. Open Society Institute can't fund a campaign, but it's the same funding mechanisms. They are getting these people elected who will not prosecute low-level crimes, and the low-level criminals are then become shock troops in some cases for political mass action, including after, during Black Lives Matter protests and things, and what was going on in America after October 7th with the repeated shutdowns of the Brooklyn Bridge and places like that. Everybody in those protests knowing that they will, if they get arrested, they will never come to trial because
Badge of
the
honor. When you
DAs.
see them, their
Yeah.
fans are all waiting for them outside the processing center when they come
Right.
out after having been bailed out. I mean,
They're
it's
beaming ear to ear,
Right.
on the way out. Yeah,
Because they have a get out of jail free card. And
Yeah.
what happened with the protesters and what happened to the people who broke into Hamilton Hall at Columbia, essentially held two janitors hostage, did property damage, and Columbia did finally call the cops on the protesters for doing this. Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, let them off. He let them off. And the next one of those people is going to shoot somebody in Manhattan. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, or throw a Molotov cocktail, or sucker punch a Jew on a subway platform. Something is going to happen. That's what when this becomes operational, copycats begin, right? I think I said after the Capitol Jewish Museum
In 2 weeks, right?
something was going to happen after this because this had happened.
I do want to note that this kind of institutional problem you're taking place is also geographically cited. That is to say, Blue America seems to have a much harder problem combating this evil than Red America. And there's the other tragedy here, which is that so many of the victims of anti-Semitism are Jews who have been devoted to peace causes beginning on October 7th, right? And so it has to be a neoconservative moment, right? You have to be mugged by reality at a certain point. I think for many American Jews, October 7th was itself a mugging by reality. And you began to see the connections between wokeism and radical anti-Semitism, right? And that type of epiphany needs to happen to more people. It needs to happen to the leaders of Jewish organizations. It needs to happen to the rabbinate, right? They have to understand what's at stake here. And of course, there's anti-Semitism on the right. We're seeing it all the time. We're seeing it in podcasts and chat groups. Don't make the problem worse, right? By bad crime policies and by bad immigration policies. Please.
We stand at a hinge moment. Jeffrey Herf had a wonderful piece hours after what happened in Boulder, talking about something we've talked about on this podcast for 4 or 5 years, really since Black Lives Matter, but certainly since October 7th, which is we have had experience when radical leftist ideas, which started supporting or enjoying or being tempted by the literal bloodlust created by violence against Western institutions, when that went from being theoretical to being actual. That was the late 1960s. Radical group, Students for a Democratic Society, particularly on the campus of Columbia University, morphed into the Weathermen, the Weather Underground, which was a domestic terrorist organization that led the way to a period in the early 70s when there were 1,200 domestic terrorist bombings in the United States, a fact that has been memory holed. It's more than half a century ago, but it's been memory holed because of the embarrassment of the left at the excesses of this movement that supposedly had grown out of a simple desire to end the war in Vietnam, such that, as Herf quotes, Mark Rudd, head of SDS at Columbia, who then became the head of the Weather Underground, said, "How joyous it is if you see the blood of a pig," meaning a dead policeman, right? Upper middle class kid, Ivy League student, celebrating the murder of some working class Irish guy whose only sin was putting on the uniform to protect other people from him. That was the great horrible irony of the rise of domestic terrorism in the United States, as has been in other countries, is that it was a luxury belief, as Rob Henderson would put it. The people who went active terrorist in the United States in the 60s and 70s were affluent, well-to-do college kids who bathed in bad ideology, turned from protest to violence. And that is what is happening right in front of our eyes right now.
Well, that is happening, but there's also another thing happening at the same time, which I think makes this a more perilous moment than even it was in the 60s and 70s. And that is, yes, there is also anti-Semitism. If there's a shared threat of anti-Semitism, that it exists on the right too, and that's dangerous. But there's also, I'm sorry, a global radical Islamic terrorist movement. It is committing attacks like car ramming attacks and stabbings all over Europe on a regular basis. There was one when I was there last week in the UK. These are happening all over the place, and that ideology is global. It's very much an attack on the West and its values. And those sorts of things, I think Americans are hesitant to look at our own society and see any connection with what goes on over there and that kind of violence. But the threat is here. The guy in Colorado was not, as far as I know, an elite Columbia graduate student. He was just, a guy who came over here from Egypt, settled in Colorado, and wanted to kill some Jews. There are a lot of those people now, too, and that's another thread. They are joined in the same, unfortunately, violent extremist cause. But I think we have to start talking again, as we did after 9/11, about radical Islamic terrorism. It is a serious threat now in our own country, and it is creating homegrown versions of terrorism that are targeting not just Jews, but symbols of Western values in Western society.
And I think we need now to sort of go to the nature of the globalized Intifada and the war against Jews and the propaganda war against Jews, because it's happening again this morning, 48 hours after it happened Sunday morning, which is to say a story coming out of Israel that Israeli troops fired wantonly on Palestinian Gazans waiting in line to get food at this new distribution center near Rafah. Now, I don't know the details of the story this morning. I mean, nobody really does. What we know is that the Red Cross and the Gaza Health Ministry report that more than a score of people were killed and dozens injured as the Israelis opened fire on this line waiting to get food.
We also know that the food distribution process was not interrupted by
that
this.
was Sunday, right? Today
or today too,
right? So first
that's
of all,
why the key word.
Sunday,
Okay,
yeah. Let me just finish.
Finish the thought.
So on Sunday, this story was transmitted by 40 news organizations on the basis of a single source, the Gaza Health Ministry, which has spent 18 years lying to these news organizations about how many Palestinians were killed. They reported double the number of Palestinian deaths than are in fact the case throughout the course of the war. They would claim that Israelis attacked hospitals wantonly when in fact it was backfiring Hamas missiles that had hit some building, or that they claimed that a hospital was a hospital when it was in fact an operational center of Hamas war-making capacities. And yet they are still being listened to. And the Israelis then released video footage of what was going on at the food distribution center on Sunday and showed that they had done nothing. So when I open my computer this morning and see a report in the New York Times that says flatly 27 people killed by Israelis in Gaza after they had been snowed on Sunday.
Quoting the
Why
same
wouldn't
source,
quoting the same source?
Gazan officials.
So I'm sure, and maybe I'm wrong, and I'll have to apologize tomorrow. I'm sure this didn't happen. And yet the New York Times is reporting it as though it is a dead, solid fact, 2 days after having been misled about this by the same people. And here they're doing it. And they know that somebody threw Molotov cocktails at Jews in Boulder, activated by these very stories that are lies about how Israel is committing a genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza, whose population number evidently has, by the way, increased since October 7th. So genocidal a war is this that the number of living Palestinians in Gaza has gone up since October 7th, not down.
I'd like to point out the key word in the stories coming out of Gaza this morning. The key word is near. The lead of all of these stories says that this incident happened near one of the food distribution sites. Near does not specify the distance. And when I hear near, and then I also read in the story that the food distribution was not interrupted by what happened, I smell something fishy going on here in the way that the New York Times, quoting Hamas, that's what Gaza official means, Hamas is up to. And here's what they're up to. The entire pro-Hamas network, the terrorists themselves, the NGOs that hate Israel and have effectively sided with Hamas in this war, and the media that parrot Hamas lies are against the new food distribution system. That is what we are fighting over now. That's what all of these stories are meant to achieve, is the undoing of the new food distribution system.
And this
Why?
is very...
Why are they? Why are they against this? Because this is the key to defeating Hamas and ending the war. The way that Hamas has survived is that they have been stealing, or probably just have been given the UN food aid since October 7th, and they have used the food and as a tool to maintain their control over Gaza and the population. And what we have witnessed since, one, the embargo on new food, and then two, when the embargo was lifted to start the new joint U.S.-Israel operation to create sites of food distribution that are free from Hamas, we have seen more protests against Hamas. We have seen Palestinians in Gaza thanking Trump, right? We have seen Hamas fire on Palestinians trying to get food. We've seen Palestinians break into warehouses where Hamas is storing the food for their own evil purposes. So this is what we're fighting over right now. And it's extremely important for people who support Israel, or for people who just want this war to end, which we all do, is to side with this new operation. Because the sooner you break the back of Hamas's control over the Palestinians in Gaza, the sooner the war will come to an end.
I think it's important to note that the people who are animated to attack Jews in the U.S. and elsewhere now, they are not stirred by the bad New York Times stories. They are getting a stream of even more egregious, totally made up stories online. That is where they live and breathe. That is their lifeblood. They are looking at TikTok and Twitter accounts and whatever else that are AI. I mean, they're just they that make the New York Times look completely credible by comparison. The kind of stuff that they live on. Pictures of one supposedly starved Palestinian child after another, who doesn't even live anywhere near the Strip, or who is actually suffering from some other disease, or
Or is
who
in Syria.
yeah, or is in Syria, or whatever. So there is this universe of complete propaganda.
Well,
That
TikTok is the worst
yeah,
offender, and
yeah.
it should be shut down in this country already. That's something the Trump administration is defying. Congress passed a law saying it should be shut down because this is CCP propaganda outlet where pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas propaganda is rampant and has been since October 7th. And in its main consumer, as Abe says, is Westerners, particularly young Americans who look at this stuff credulously, believe it, and don't. There's nothing to counter it with because TikTok dominates in terms of their social media feeds.
But in the end, if you take this all and you put it into a stew pot, what you have is Israel was attacked on October 7th, and immediately a PSYOP counter operation was launched to not only to excuse away the attacks of October 7th, but to make them seem justified, conceivably, or to say that all Jews in the world bear collective responsibility for the crimes that are supposedly being done to Palestinians. Such crimes are not being done. So therefore, you have a lie upon a lie upon a lie. And that is where this is analogous to the medieval blood libel, which alleged that Jews kidnapped Christian children to kill them, to drain their blood, to use their blood in Passover matzot and in rituals and in religious rituals, right? The case of Richard of York, which is which is the sort of the key moment in Western history of the blood libel, missing boy, accusations that Jews had killed him for ritualistic purposes. We are now 9 centuries removed from that barbaric moment, and here it is again. Jews are just shooting. Jews are not shooting Palestinians trying to get food. Jews are accused of it. It is reported by supposedly independent, objective authorities that it is true when it is not. And therefore, when you are telling the story of the Boulder firebombing, you somehow get to edge into the story the fact that there seems to be some controversy going on halfway around the world in which Jews are being mean to Palestine, shooting Palestinians. Ergo, there's something a little defensible about what happened in Boulder, or at least exculpatory or explanatory. And that is the horror that we are living with. It is astounding, and we cannot abide it. So how do we not abide it? Because we're saying authorities need to be better, and our authority this and that and the other thing. Well, I think the answer, there are 2 answers, one of which is Israel needs to close its eyes and stop taking phone calls from Steve Witkoff if necessary, and win this war. There's a piece in the Washington Free Beacon on the Israeli war strategy. Sounds to me like it's too distended because it takes about 4 months, according to the Israeli strategy, in 3 stages. And I think that's too long because I don't know how much more, I don't know what's going to happen in the course of those 4 months, how many firebombings there are going to be elsewhere, and how much pressure is going to be levied on Israel while this is happening. And they clearly have the ability to take Hamas out now, and they're waiting because they want to negotiate over the lives of the hostages. And I am deeply in sympathy with this, but there are 20 hostages in horrible and monstrous and awful conditions. And I think by the end of the day today, it's possible that in this counter war that's launched here now, there will have been 4 dead. That is the 2 people shot at the Capitol Jewish Museum. And from what I hear, maybe 2 of the people who were hit by the firebomb in Boulder. And I don't know how many more people are going to die. And so we're going to have this trade-off. The way to end the war on the Jews is for the Jews to win this war. It is the only solution that we have to end the war with a Jewish victory that cuts the heart out of the fantasy that the Jews can be defeated. We can be forced back into a cave. Israel can be destroyed existentially, and the like. The impact of Israel extirpating Hamas and forcing it out of Gaza, or killing every last member of Hamas, or whatever it is, will be very far-reaching and revolutionary and change the entire dynamic of the 21st century, in my view.
And I want to add one thing
Yeah.
to that, which is, you're right. Just to go back to the second Intifada, when Israel went into the West Bank, into Jenin, had the tanks surrounding Arafat's compound, it was effective. It was effective. And it wasn't just that. The next year, 2003, America ended Saddam Hussein's rule in Iraq. And Saddam Hussein had been paying the families of Palestinian suicide bombers, had been supporting them throughout the Second Intifada. And so that foreign support was cut off in addition to Israel's military success in the West Bank. So look at today. Israel needs to succeed in Gaza, and we need to cut off the foreign support for Hamas. Now, with Qatar, it's complicated. Shouldn't be complicated, but apparently it's complicated for the Trump administration as well as other American administrations. But Iran is not so complicated. And so America needs to do two things. One, no daylight with Israel. Let it finish the job in Gaza. And two, get out of these stupid negotiations with Iran that are leading nowhere and are reckless, and therefore force the issue of Iranian denuclearization while it's still weakened from Israel's attack last year.
We need to talk about that quickly, because yesterday came the story that Steve Witkoff had agreed in principle with the Iranians to allow small quantities of uranium enrichment as part of an overall deal with Iran. And for the life of me, reading the details that were leaked out to Barak Ravid of Axios, I assume from the Witkoff Vance ambit,
Gabbard,
that not a lot of difference between that and the JCPOA of 2015, the Iran deal that Trump himself said was the worst deal ever struck, and that he pulled the United States out of in 2018. 7 years later, he's got this real estate moron from New York who never heard of Iran until, January of 2025. He says, go make a deal. And Witkoff, who was trying to negotiate a deal, and the Iranians say, we need enrichment. And he keeps going back and saying, okay, a little enrichment. So Trump was compelled last night on Truth Social to say, no enrichment. No enrichment, no enrichment. And
Which also, can I just add that back and forth, which has now happened several times with lots of negotiations. It's happened with Russia. It's happened elsewhere. That makes us look weak. It makes the administration look weak. There was a story about how Putin has joked, Russian state media has been joking about, oh, well, he said that, his negotiator said that today, but tomorrow he'll change his mind. We look indecisive. We look undisciplined. We look like we don't know what we're doing. And I think that affects our negotiations with other countries as well, not just with Iran.
Well, looks don't deceive, because we are weak. And if we restarted these negotiations with Iran, Trump wrote the letter to Khamenei. Khamenei didn't write a letter to Trump. And now the Trump administration is negotiating with itself over whether or not to permit enrichment. And you apparently have these two sides of the Trump administration having an argument in public, using Barak Ravid and some people at the New York Times, not only to reveal what our ideas are.
The Washington Post has become ground zero of anti-Israel leaks from the Trump administration.
So the two things are what the Trump negotiators are seeming to cave to Iran for, and leaking Israel's potential war plans to make it harder for Israel to strike Iran if it feels the need to do so. That's going on inside the US administration. It's not foreign sources. It's not the Iranians leaking to the New York Times, and it's us leaking to us about us against us.
Can I just make a point about Gabbard in an entirely different theater in what
Our
is
director of national intelligence,
right? Vis-a-vis a different theater in what is becoming World War III, in my view. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, went to the Shangri-La conference in Singapore over the weekend. He gave what I thought was a very good speech. I wouldn't agree with every part of it, but the truth is I agreed with 96% of it. And it was about the threat from China, and it was about American commitment to the Indo-Pacific. And it was about that the potential for Chinese action against Taiwan could be imminent, right? The next day I heard an interview with DNI Gabbard on the Daily Wire. It's Morning Wire program, must listen. And the anchor asked her, well, what was your take on the conference? And her take was, we sent a message of peace. And then the anchor said, well, what about the China threat? And her response was, there's so many threats in the world. And it was clear from this interview that the debate that we're having about Israel within the administration, about Iran within the administration, is the same debate we're now having about China within the administration. I kind of leave Russia aside. I think there's not much debate within the administration on Russia-Ukraine. There is debate between the administration and Republicans in Congress on Russia-Ukraine. But this is we're used to infighting within an administration. There was a lot of infighting within Reagan's administration. But it takes a president to lay down the policy. And this is why I thought that Truth Social post was very important from President Trump.
About enrichment.
About no enrichment. That has been his commitment throughout this entire process. That is what a supermajority of Republicans in the Senate and in the House support. No enrichment for Iran if you want to make a deal. President Trump needs to send that message not just once, but again and again and again to his own people.
It's even better or worse than that, depending on where you stand. Because according to Rasmussen reports, close to 60% of the American people favor military action against Iran's nuclear program if necessary. A supermajority of Americans in a poll that is considered Republican or MAGA leaning support military action against Iran. They are not restrainers, as it turns out. It's not that they want it to happen regardless of circumstances. What they meant is they are open to a military strike on Iran if that's the only way to make sure that Iran doesn't get a bomb. That is the opinion of the American people. That's pretty staggering. And so the restrainers who seem to be motivating this both anti-Israel activism and some kind of, peace deal making with Iran are swimming upstream against American opinion, not leading it, because they have been banging on this for years and the American people aren't buying. 65% opposed the JCPOA in 2015. Apparently, they didn't all die off. They're still there. They still think Iran is the major threat to the United States in the Middle East. They're right. They believe an Iranian bomb is a major threat to the existential future of mankind. They are correct. And they are willing to consider taking very significant action to prevent that from happening. And that should be an arrow in Trump's quiver, rather than something that he's got people in his administration attempting to poo-poo and pretend isn't really happening. And then finally, I guess, in the last couple of minutes, we should make note of this astounding operation that Ukraine pulled off, doing tens of billions of dollars of damage to Russian military assets deep inside Russia in an astoundingly brilliant plan to hide drones in trucks that they drove as far away from the Ukrainian Russian border as Sevastopol in Siberia.
And thankfully didn't give the Trump administration a heads up about this plan before
well,
doing
if
it.
they did, yeah,
They did
either
not.
they didn't or the
They
Trump
did not,
administration. Yeah,
evidently.
right.
Thank
Okay.
goodness.
So right. Anyway, what they showed was that as there's been this kind of weird triumphalism among the restrainers who seem to have no interest in restraining Russia, just us, like all restrainers. Policy is always about restraining the United States and not a global wide restraint doctrine. Um, they said we can fight this war on many fronts. Don't think we're done. We are not toast. We have just, Russia is going to have to figure out some way to replace the weaponry that we destroyed. Its pipelines are getting shut down. So panicked did this make Steve Bannon, Putin's chief bootlicker, say that we needed to embargo Ukraine for having done such a dastardly act in the course of a war that was a response to an invasion of Ukrainian territory in an effort to destroy Ukraine as a country. So the world is a very interesting place. People are very committed to their own fantasies.
Alex Jones one-upped Bannon because Alex Jones advocated our policy should be unilateral withdrawal from NATO because of this attack.
Hey, why not?
I mean,
isn't he supposed to be like living in a cardboard box?
Yeah, he came back.
Alex Jones, didn't he have a $12 billion?
No, he ended up winning in a kind of a roundabout way. So he's back at it and kind of reintegrated into
great. Congratulations to the
MAGA media.
To the MAGA media. So let's see what he does next to discredit them.
I just want to say a couple things about this attack. It's not going to lead to World War III. Second, it will protect Ukrainian cities. Think about how when Russia strikes Ukraine, what does it target? It targets the civilian population centers. Been doing it since the beginning of the war. When Ukraine targets Russia, what does Ukraine target? Military assets. And that should be all you need to know about who is on the right side in this conflict. It's too much for some people. The problem, though, is that Ukraine has stunning technology, stunning operational, knowledge, capability, sunk the Russian Black Sea fleet, pulled this off, destroying these strategic bombers deep inside Russia, has held its own for now 3 years of brutal conflict. It still faces a manpower deficit on the ground. Russia is still grinding it out. It is estimated that Russia will reach the 1 million man casualty mark sometime this summer. That is an incredible damning indictment of Putin there. The issue is Putin's now reconstructed his country for one sole purpose, and that's war. That's war. And so it's this attack by Ukraine is amazing, but it's not enough. It's not enough.
It's not enough. And I think you make one important point, then we should go to Christine for her recommendation. But not only has Putin reconfigured the country for war, he has reconfigured the country economically for war,
right.
According to the Institute for the Study of War.
Exactly.
The only way, essentially, it's a kind of government economy that is spending money on the military at levels that have never been seen before. And it is the largest driver of economic growth, sort of Keynesian economic growth, is spending on military equipment, materials, manpower, all of that. There is nothing else going on in Russia.
But that got the Soviet Union into deep trouble.
So I'm not saying it's like short term.
But I say the response that America should take is to heighten the contradictions,
right,
as the Marxists say.
And it was.
This
and
is the time for the secondary sanctions that the Senate wants to pass.
And of course, yeah,
this is the time for foreign military sales
Yeah.
We don't have to just give them the stuff. We allow them the Ukrainians to
The Ukrainians.
buy the stuff from us,
Right.
right?
Right.
That's what we need to do.
Remember that the Soviets were hastened in the last 5 years of the life of the Soviet Union. What hastened the destruction of the Soviet Union was the announcement of a policy that all the elites in the United States made fun of, which was the Strategic Defense Initiative, because Gorbachev heard about us trying to figure out how to create missile defense in space and said, we are in no position to afford to match them move for move here. We're broke. We need to change our economy to find some way to get funds and resources to protect ourselves from the United States' technological advantage. And Glasnost and Perestroika were the result. And the internal contradictions of the Soviet Union brought it down once there was a little liberation there in 5 years. If we were to, it's not going to happen, obviously, if we were to start aggressively funding, selling, whatever, to Ukraine to put Putin in the position in which every dollar he spends on the military is a dollar wasted, and his country begins to sink under its own burdens, that would be an extraordinary benefit and advantage, except to the people who really love to go to Moscow on his dime and ride in the beautiful carpeted subway system with the chandeliers, and go to a supermarket like Tucker Carlson, who apparently had never been to a supermarket before. Christine, you have a recommendation.
I know I do. I've slight regret about it now after we've had such a dark kind of summary of the world's events. But I'm going to do it anyway because I'm in a big crime spree. I'm not a crime spree, crime reading spree. I just finished another.
What do you have to confess?
It's not a crime spree.
Okay.
But this actually is a Netflix crime thriller. It's called Department Q. It's set in Edinburgh. It's actually based on a series, a crime fiction series that's written by a Danish author, but it's very dark. It's very Scottish, British production and British actors, including the lead played by Matthew Good, who's great. And Kelly MacDonald, who plays a therapist in there. A wonderful, wonderful cast. It is gritty. It is dark, but it's mesmerizing. And it's the story of a police detective who's injured in the line of duty. His partner also injured, and he's sort of shunted off to a basement office to stay out of the way of the police chief, who finds him bothersome, and given cold cases to solve. So he has to pick a cold case and solve it. All of this, of course, to please his superiors at the government, which wants to show that it's solving these cases. But he ends up becoming engrossed in a missing persons report of a prosecutor who'd gone missing 4 years earlier. And the series over time shows you glimpses of her before her disappearance, some of the cases she was trying. It shows them tracking down different leads. What I loved about it, and again, because I read a lot of Japanese crime fiction, is just it should seem tedious, but it's not. Just how methodical a really good investigator has to be. They have to follow all these pathways that might lead to nothing, but occasionally gives them that one clue that then sends them in the right direction. And the plotting of this is very much in that sort of spirit. The acting is wonderful. The relationships among the detectives and the various family members that are shown is very good. It is not a happy show, so if you're looking for something mindless and enjoyable, don't go to this show. But if you like kind of gritty crime dramas, this is a good one with a nice embedded mystery that unspools over, I think it's 10 episodes. I'm not sure, but I really enjoyed it. Department Q on Netflix.
Matthew Good, the star of the show, is like one of the great unsung, unheralded.
He's amazing. Yes,
remarkable chameleon-like actors. If you remember 15 years ago, there was a not very good film version of the sort of most famous revisionist comic book ever written, Watchmen, which is sort of like the reverse Avengers. And he plays the smartest man in the world. And it's an extraordinary performance. He as Ozymandias. And then 4 or 5 years ago, they made this pretty comically wrongheaded but delightful docudrama on Paramount Plus about the making of The Godfather from the perspective of its weird producer, Al Ruddy, a show I loved, but is really not a good history of the making of
Well,
The
you
Godfather.
liked the show.
I did like the show.
Oh, okay.
But it's
Good.
very
I
silly.
should watch it. Yeah,
Because
okay.
it's a wrong perspective. It's like how Al Ruddy made The Godfather, which is really not
well,
true.
you're a Godfather stan.
I
so
am a
if
Godfather
you like,
stan,
so if
yes.
you like the show, though, then I should
not a
watch it.
purist.
Matthew Good, a Scottish actor, plays Robert Evans, the sybaritic, bacchanalian, shirt manufacturing Upper West Side Jew who became the head of Paramount for mysterious reasons and was one of the motive forces and fighters to make The Godfather. And his performance as Evans in The Offer, Good's performance, is like one for the ages. Is just
he is
thrilling.
English, not Scottish.
Oh, he's English.
He's
sorry.
an English actor, yeah.
I'm
But
sorry.
no, he's
Anyway,
amazing.
He is one of those guys who you don't recognize from role to role because he just, and it's not like he's Daniel Day-Lewis transformed or one of that. He just simply can do anything, it appears, in any accent.
They did
way.
have to scruff him up a bit for this one because he's quite physically attractive, and kind of normal. And he's very tall and lanky, so he hunches and he's wearing like moth-eaten wool sweaters and he's got a scraggly beard. But you're still like, oh no, you're still beautiful, you're still great. But he does inhabit the role of the beleaguered, detective very well.
All right, so that's, again, Department Q on Netflix. We'll be back tomorrow. For Matt, Christine, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.